Everyone always talks about storytelling, and for good reason, but in this video, I want to tell you why that word in particular might not be quite as useful as you think, whether you're brand new to writing or you're more experienced. I read a lot of stories from writers that are building their skills in storytelling, and there's one mistake that I see time and time again that lets their stories down. It's hard to describe, but it feels like they're writing their stories from really far away. They're writing as though they're hovering some distance away from what's actually happening and just about managing to recount that to their readers. I'll give you some examples in a sec, but what happens when you write like this is that the scene that you're describing feels flatter, the characters feel further away, and those fine details are much harder to notice. What I think we should do, first of all, isn't really tell a story, it's more share a story. And we should do it from amongst the scenes and characters that we're writing about, as close to them as we can get. We should describe things from besides our character. We should share the story from that point and then pull our reader in so that they're with us as well. I mentioned examples, so I'm working on a sci-fi-ish novel at the moment, and I found a few lines that I think I can demonstrate this with. This scene is some of my characters arriving at a remote research base. Also, if you've seen any of my other videos about this project, Project Ventus, I swear other stuff happens than people arriving at remote research bases. That just seems to be all I ever talk about. But honestly, things do happen. There's a bit with a helicopter, there's other research bases, there's an island, there's this whole plot sequence. Anyway, here's a passage where I'm telling that story and I'm creating that unwanted distance. So I'm here as the author, the story is somewhere over there, and the reader is I don't know where. When they arrived, the station lights flickered on, along with the air conditioning. It hummed as it powered up from the lower levels and made its way up. Cool air met the heat of the desert. They closed the door to the outside and shut out the dust from the helicopter. Alright, nothing blaringly terrible maybe, but ask yourself this. How real does that feel? How close are you to it? Does it feel as though the scene in front of you is crystal clear? I'd venture a guess that the answer is probably not. And the reason for that is I'm telling the story. I'm reporting what's happening. I'm just stating facts. What's missing is experience. The experience of the characters is what creates the experience of the reader. While all of the facts that I mentioned might be accurate to the story, that might be what really happens, it all feels a bit dull, really, doesn't it? Because nobody's experiencing anything. It's all a bit detached. No one's blinking in those fluorescent lights, and no one's gasping at that fresh air, and nobody's waving dust out of their face. What's important for you to avoid creating that unwanted distance or that barrier around your story is for you to present your story through your character's eyes. And I don't mean simply saying she heard this or they felt that. We don't always have to frame it quite so bluntly. We just have to position ourselves and our readers in the scene on the ground with the characters, standing among them instead of floating above them. That way we can find out what they might see and observe, and we can write that instead of just blandly reporting on facts from far away. I just want to take a few seconds to remind you about the developmental editing service that I run on my website. If you've got a piece of a novel or some short fiction that you really would like some feedback on, check out the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. Right, back to the video. Here's how that passage from my book actually appears, at least in the current draft anyway. All the information is the same, but it's just presented differently. There was a metallic rattle, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered on along with the air conditioning. Wren heard the hum as it powered up from far below them in the depths of the station, making its way up to greet them. Cool air finally passed over her and clashed against the heat from outside before Petra heaved the hatch door closed. Now, as usual, I'm not professing myself to be a brilliant writer, but I do think this would pull a reader in more than the first version. I think it would help them feel like they're among the story, rather than disconnected from it and floating some distance away. In other words, being shown or sharing in the story, as opposed to just being told about it. So what did I actually do? What are the differences between those two passages, and what effects do those differences have? I started with this. You'll notice nobody really witnesses anything here. Everything just kind of happens, it's really passive, and there's no frame for us to view everything that's happening through. It feels disconnected, and it's really lacking any observable details. So I changed it to this. So I gave the lights coming on a bit of a rattle, which is a sound for the characters to hear, which doubles up on the flickering of the lights as they come on. I added the word overhead, which I hope might make readers think about looking up in their mind, which subconsciously might place them into that corridor, onto the floor of the station with my characters, as opposed to floating somewhere else away witnessing it. In the next line, I mentioned my character Wren, because the darkness is now lifted, the lights have come on, so we should be able to see her. Ren can hear the sounds of the air conditioning building up, and now the reader can hear that too because they're stood next to Ren rather than levitating above her or away from her somewhere outside of the station. And as the word overhead might have suggested to them that they are looking up or made them subconsciously feel like they're looking up towards the lights, the word below might do the same thing for what's beneath them, and they might be thinking about what's in the depths of the station. Then Ren feels the cold air passing over her, and it's just really hard to hear about someone having cold air passing over them without imagining the feeling of cold air passing over you. And I think that stuff pulls the reader in a lot closer than we were before. It makes it feel like we, the author, are standing with the characters while we tell the story, and the reader is right there with us. And all of those details are still viewed through the character. Ren is still the vessel for all of this information, I guess. But that doesn't mean I have to say Ren heard, Ren saw, Ren felt the entire time. I only had one of those, I think, Ren hearing the air conditioning building up. The rest of them are just kind of implied, or we know that she's experiencing them because we're stood next to her in the scene. And this stuff doesn't just help scenes like that one that are a little sparse on detail. You can use details like this to tighten up and bring your reader closer to much larger, much more distant sounding passages as well. I've made up an example for this, but I'll read it to you and you'll know what I mean by distant and far away. They kept up the pace over the next few weeks, walking all day. The land became more rugged and hard to traverse as the season grew colder, and they didn't make as much progress as they needed to ensure survival. When someone grew sick, they had no choice but to carry them for days through the mountain passes. So even though this feels much larger and much more distant, we can still fix it in the same way. We can still close that distance by sharing things with our reader. It's details and moments spent with characters that will pull the reader closer. The first part is weeks worth of story compressed into just a few words. This isn't going to create an image in a reader's mind or place them there in the roadside. It's spreading too little story over too long a time. This is telling a reader about our story rather than sharing the story with them. Then I mentioned the land getting more rugged and the season getting colder, but again, there's nobody there to experience those things. I did say they to refer to the characters, so we know they're there at least, but they don't feel very present. It still feels like we're observing them from some distance away. And the next part then, I said that they haven't made as much progress as they needed to, but the question that arises in my mind when I read that is, how do we know? Where's that information coming from? At the moment, nowhere. It's not really connected to anyone or anything. Then finally, we're carrying a sick person through the mountains, except we're not really because nobody's sick and nobody's carrying. It reads like a concept rather than something that's actually happening. So what would I do to change this? How would I pull the reader closer to these events? Well, I'll tell you what I would write, and then I'll explain a bit about why. So here it is. The family stood shoulder to shoulder at the roadside one uncountable morning as the eldest son kicked dirt over the embers of their fire. Days of this ritual had become weeks, like the turn of a great wheel beneath them. At what she thought was midday, the mother looked back over her shoulder at her family, half swallowed by the mist behind her. She hugged her billowing rags closer and straightened again to face the peaks ahead, still a season away. "We cannot hope to get there before the snows come," she said into the wind, words lost among the rocks. Better that way. 3 peaks further into the journey, on a day where the snow seemed to lay poised above them, her husband fell ill and could not get up. She and the eldest son took an arm and a leg each and dragged him along the knife edge of the pass, while the snow covered their tracks behind them, a silent, stalking animal. Much longer, yeah, but much more immediate and present, I think. Again, even though the scale is bigger, we're seeing more time passing, I'm still dipping into individual moments to show how that time passes. That way, all of that time is kind of coloured in. We're giving the reader something to visualise and think about to occupy that time. Instead of just blank days passing at the start, I made a scene of one particular day that can represent all of the days. And again, we as the author and the reader are standing among them as they kick dirt onto the embers of the fire. We're not floating off somewhere else watching it from a distance. To try and show how much time is still left in their journey, I made a scene where the mother looks off through the peaks, which represent time. And the reader is there, again, on the road, both looking behind her to her family and ahead of her to the journey yet to come. I mentioned that they weren't making enough progress in the last version, and we didn't really know where that information came from, so in this version, I made that dialogue. It's quiet, it's quite hard to hear dialogue being snatched away from the wind, so the reader almost has to lean in to hear it. Dialogue, by the way, is a fantastic quick tip to make a scene feel more immediate and like it's happening in front of you. Then, instead of the general scenario or the concept of someone who's ill and being carried, I made that into a scene as well. While they struggled, I showed the family's tracks in the snow and then we watched from behind them as the snow sort of crept up on them. Now, none of that is perfect writing or how I would necessarily write that kind of story, but what it does have is the immediacy and the detail of showing rather than the blurriness and the distance of telling. It occurred to me after I recorded basically all of this video that I'd missed an opportunity to further explain what I mean here. Because something I didn't say, and I definitely should have, is that this detached, distant view isn't always a bad thing. It can be something that works really well in stories too. And the way I wanted to explain how is to think of it like a camera. The distant, detached view is sort of like an establishing shot in a movie. There's a wide-angle lens, so we see a lot of the landscape and the setting and the context of the story, but we don't see the smaller details. Whereas when we write from among the characters and within the scene, it's more like your standard close-up shot, I guess. And here we do see the detail and the expressions on our characters' faces, that kind of thing. So establishing shots can definitely be useful in a story, especially when you're setting everything up. The problem I sometimes see newer writers making is that they use establishing shots like this all through their story, or they use them too often, or they use them when the readers will want that detail and they'll want to be pulled in closer to the characters. If you think about it, a whole movie of establishing shots wouldn't feel right. Close-ups, I think, should definitely make up the vast majority of the story. Maybe not 100%, but most of it. Anyway, just wanted to add that in. To avoid your story feeling vague and off, make what happens into a literal moment or a scene in the story. Instead of telling us they walked for days, show us the dust on their worn-out shoes. Think about what your characters would be able to experience from where they're standing, what they can see and feel, then get in close and write the story from there to pull the reader in with you. It's all about taking a moment from your story and pulling your reader down into it. That's what makes writing more interesting and more real, in my opinion. And if you're not too sure what kind of moment's worth pulling your reader down into, try this video next. It's all about how a simple moment from a song made me into a better writer. Thank you so much for watching, as always, and happy writing.